Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with pollster Doug Kaplan. He is the president of Kaplan Strategies, which is a polling and communications firm that has worked with campaigns at the local, state, and federal level in the United States, and has also done a bit of work in Canada as well. And Doug is credited with having one of the most accurate polls leading up to the 2024 election by predicting that Donald Trump would win the popular vote by 1%. And so I thought to chat with Doug about what is the value of polling today, given that if you look at any sort of presidential approval rating or where the public stands on different policy issues, in a two-party system like the US, it just breaks down in terms of Republicans support Donald Trump and Democrats do not support Donald Trump. And same with Joe Biden. High support among Democrats, low support among Republicans. So what actually is the value of polling today? What are the sort of key challenges and innovations that are happening in polling? So we actually don't talk so much about social media in this episode, but Doug is an expert pollster, and so I wanted to see what was going on that side, particularly in the US. And Doug is based in Florida, where he's worked on several local and state level races. And I think Florida is just a fascinating case to focus on because first, it is one of these key swing states, even though that may be not so much the case right now, but we'll talk about that in the episode. And second, that it's super diverse in terms of ethnicity. There's a large religious population, and it's one of the states with the highest number of old people. And I'm curious to hear how that affects polling and communication. So this is very much an episode focused on polling and the US and later on Florida. But nevertheless, I hope that those tuning in from abroad find it interesting. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Doug Kaplan. Again, he is the president of Kaplan Strategies. Doug, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start out a bit with current news as we're just heading into the second month of Trump's second term as we're recording this. As a pollster, you've been covering public opinion of Trump across multiple election cycles. What are we seeing now on Trump approval and his policies, given all these executive orders that have been coming out over the past couple of weeks?
I think depending where you look, I think his approval rating is about 5 to 10 points higher than last time in 2016, 2017. If you go 8 years ago, you had Robert Mueller, you had all those things. You couldn't even imagine that this time. So it's a much different landscape for him.
And I want to ask you a little bit about at least what Gallup is reporting for presidential approval, because they break things down by like overall presidential approval and then approval on various issues. And we tend to see these two kind of converge, right? You either support Trump and all of his issues or you don't. There's not a huge difference between like maybe it's 90% approval for Republicans for Trump, but then maybe 89 or 88% on various issues. I mean, what can we read from that with Trump being so aligned with individual policies for both how Republicans and Democrats view him?
Yeah, listen, there's a lot of independence in this country, and that's what it comes down to. People in the middle, where they're moving to and how they decided the election. Now, I would say they decided the last election. There was a 4 to 5 point swing from Trump-Harris to Trump-Biden.
And what is your take as a pollster on independence in general, right? There are people who report that they're independent, but if you look at other indicators, they may lean one way or the other. What is actually an independent in polling terms?
An independent can be more conservative than an actual conservative or more liberal than an actual liberal. They might be fed up with the party structure. But I think you have a 10 to 20% of people that are really in the center on this country. They might be pro-choice, but their views on taxes might be conservative or, vice versa. So I think the balance is always the middle in this country. which right now is really suburbia. I think the fight is suburbia, and that's what Trump was able to effectively do last time, was to win the suburbs or to not lose them in a high enough margin to lose the election.
And when you say that it's about independence, and particularly in the suburbs, I mean, at least when it comes to presidential elections, there's so much talk about these, 6 or 7 swing states. Is it independence in the swing states that matter, or is it just independence across?
It's a couple of things. It's independence in the swing states, but then it's about turnout. Trump has done a masterful job turning out every single possible person in rural America. He's drawn more votes each time. So he's had a phenomenal get out the vote operation. And so he's been able to draw these people in rural America. I think he was 7 for 7 last election. He won Nevada as well. So he's really been able to turn his voters out. Harris was not able to do that last election. She got a lot less votes than Biden did. It doesn't mean that those people voted for Trump. It just means those people stayed home.
Right. And I'm just picking on this idea of polling, because when we see such this, huge partisan gap where you have 90% of Republicans supporting Trump, only 5% supporting his approval for Democrats. And when it was Joe Biden in the White House, it was the exact opposite, right? So I'm curious, what is the value of polling today when we have such of a partisan split? I mean, if it's about turnout, how do you, for example, poll for turnout? Because it doesn't seem that asking people who they support, it just breaks down by partisan lines, right?
Well, you look at how likely they are to vote, and other questions based on the voter files. We had one of the most accurate polls. We had Trump winning by 1% last election, which he did win by 1%. But polls are very valuable for all types of things. It's a barometer of America. We're in a partisan, it's a very, very partisan type of arena right now. We have not had a blowout type of election in a very long time. You go back to Obama the first time, that was a big win. But then before that, you'd have to go all the way back to Clinton in '92. So we just haven't, we've had these really partisan elections that have been so close by 1%. You've had these minority governments. If you look at Bush and then you look at Trump the first time, now Trump won by 1%. So I guess that's not a minority government. So it's so close. It's such a partisan type of environment. And I think what the Democrats are doing is they're laying low, and they're going to be reactive when events happen. Instead of going out there, they're going to let it organically happen, the opposition.
Yeah, I want to get to communication in a second, but you mentioned your poll that was accurately predicting Trump by 1%, whereas a lot of polls had Harris up by like 0.2 or even a little bit higher. What do you think explains the accuracy of your poll versus other polls? I saw you had something like 670 respondents, so it was a relatively small sample, but how did you calibrate it to get that accurate prediction?
I think our method, we did text to web panel, and we didn't do call center. So I think we got more of the Trump voter in there. I think Trump voters don't answer the phones. But that's a whole other thing. We got lucky, which was within a margin of error. It could have been 2%, 3%, whatever. It could have went the other way. We had Paris up 4 in September. We had a 5-point swing in that election. So there was a point that she was ahead after her convention. And she couldn't close the deal.
And so when you have a poll in the margin of error, does that really, like, the exact people that you contact, could that swing?
Yeah, it could be the sample. I mean, listen, things can go wrong in a statistically given sample. There's a 95% confidence level. So 5% of all polls are wrong, right? But a margin of error, let's say it's 3% margin of error. My poll had Trump winning by 1. I could have had Trump winning by 4, or I could have had Harris winning by 2, and I still would have been successful. It would have been in my margin of error. And people want things to be exact, but that's why the margin of error is so critical, because it's always going to fall within that. That's why the averages you see on Real Clear Politics or 538 are really important, because they average all the polls, and it usually comes out pretty close.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to pick up a little bit more on what's going on with polling methodology. But let's switch to communication, because at Kaplan Strategies, you also offer political marketing services like streaming TV, Facebook advertising, and direct mail. So I'm curious how polling factors into that more communication side. Is it about informing the content strategy or measuring its impact, or some mix between the two?
Well, we would do private polling for customers, and then it would scientifically tell us, okay, this is how we should do your social media. This is how we should do your mail. This is how we should do your streaming based on these issues of moving voters. So it's very effective to do polling. You'd be surprised the amount of people that don't do polling. They might have $100,000 budget, but they don't want to spend a little bit of money on polling, so they don't know where they're at. They're just assuming, and you never know. I mean, you could be running a local election, and a landfill could be the biggest issue. So that's why polling is critical.
And so let's say that you find out through polling that landfill is the biggest issue. How do you make the jump from polling to what should actually be the medium? Should it be streaming or Facebook or direct mail? And then how do you actually frame that message in a way that either converts or turns out voters?
Mail is very effective. Go along with streaming. The way streaming works is you can match voters up now. So only those people would see the advertisements. Let's say you group 2,000 people, 20,000 people. Only a portion of those 20,000 people you match, let's say 70%. Are going to see your advertisements. So you're not wasting money on people who aren't going to vote. And you have a good idea of who's going to vote based on prior voting history.
Right. But that's about getting the right target audience. But then what about, how do you actually move their opinion or actually drive them to go to the polling station? Like, it seems that the message is actually quite important. Or is it enough just to mention the landfill?
Yeah, so the landfill is the biggest issue. And if, let's say, I'm running against the incumbent, I rail against the establishment. I talk about how they've been inept on the landfill. I remind them to vote. I tell them, it's public record. You haven't voted yet. Please vote. And you always have to decide if you're going to go national or local in a race. Many races you run it nationally. National issues, but some races are local. It's about development and landfills and schools. So that's why polling is very important.
So you make those distinctions between national level issues and local issues in the polls.
Right.
Interesting. But I'm curious because this connection between polling and communication, I mean, it's changing every cycle. The polling methodologies are changing, the outreach methods are changing, but also where you can advertise is changing, from streaming TV being popular just a few years ago to all these various social media. Coming out of 2024, I mean, is there anything that was really a game changer this cycle on the polling side or the advertising side? Or was it just kind of the same core principles that were driving strategy?
It's not something that I specialize in yet, but a lot of the TikTok videos or the Instagram that are influencer based are very effective, the TikTok and all that. So that's very effective. And I think the streaming is very effective because, again, you could target different portions of voters. You could target African Americans in Detroit, Hispanics in Nevada, with different messages based on what, the issues are, what the polling says. Someone like Trump or Harris, they have professional pollsters that work for them. They have a poll in the field every day.
Yeah, which brings me to the role of pollsters, because we've talked to a few pollsters on the show that mostly work with left-wing candidates. And they were kind of saying that the idea of the pollster as just kind of surveying public opinion and running the numbers is a little bit inaccurate, that a pollster today is more of a strategist who kind of sits at the table with the main decision makers of the campaign. Is that accurate? How do you view the role of the pollster in today's elections?
It depends on what the role the campaign's going to give you, right? They might go a la carte. They just might want to do a poll, or they might want to do everything. They might want you for strategy consulting and all that stuff. So it depends. But I view polling as part of a campaign to the bigger prize of strategy consulting and helping them with their advertising and messaging.
And is one better than the other in your view? Do you think that it's better to integrate the pollster to a higher decision making level, or does it just depend on the campaign?
It depends on the size of the campaign, but I think it's more cost effective to integrate for sure.
How so?
It's just more cost effective for the campaign versus hiring this guy and that guy and that guy, and you have so many chefs in the kitchen. But something like that wouldn't work in like Trump's campaign because or Harris's campaign, because they have their pollster, but then they have their strategists, and then they have this person, that person. They're like medium-sized businesses that are drawn up in a year or 100 days. So everybody's got a different role. We specialize more in small and medium-sized campaigns.
Right. And I'm curious, when you're talking about small and medium-sized campaigns, is the role of the pollster just for election cycles? I mean, is there, in between election cycles, is there a role for polling once you're in government or maybe in opposition looking to start getting a feel for the electorate?
Absolutely. You should know where you're at, what the voters are thinking about the issues that you're going to vote on. So there is a role, yes.
And is that something that these small and medium-sized campaigns are open to?
Well, more congressional or Senate or people that are in office on the state level.
That they're willing to pay for pollsters to just keep monitoring where voters are at in terms of policy, see if their policies are resonating.
Yeah, or if there's a big issue coming up or something like that.
Hmm. And I mean, I'm thinking, you mentioned 538 earlier, and I'm thinking of maybe this is more forecasting than polling, right? But there does seem to be a growing sophistication in aggregating polls, weighting them, bringing in all sorts of historical data, machine learning, predictive modeling. Like these models for forecasting are getting very sophisticated, and they're using polling data. Are you seeing similar types of developments on the polling methodology side?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problems pollsters have is costs, right? They're reaching people. People don't answer the phones, because even cell phones anymore, they just don't. So you have to call a lot more people. So there's other methods, text to web panels. I mean, in parts of the world, they don't even do phone polls. They do web in Europe and places like that. So it depends on what methodology you're using and, your turnout model, testing different turnout models, what they could be.
And what goes into a turnout model? Again, I'm thinking about forecasting, where they're trying to do all these crazy kind of machine learning predictions. Is polling at that level as well?
I think a little bit, but I don't think fully, no.
Because one thing I was thinking about, there's been a lot of talk about, and I hate to use the term AI, but in terms of automated generative content creation, right? So this idea of using AI chatbots for whether it's text copy or images. I mean, this didn't really happen so much this cycle, but I'm wondering about on the back end, at least for research, there's been ideas about using AI to generate survey questions or even to generate synthetic populations of voters. So you would ask, rather than have to call and get 700 people to answer the phone or text to web or whatever, they would poll a chatbot generated audience. Is anything like that going on?
I've heard of some stuff going on like that, and there's a conference actually I'm going to. I'm interested in finding out more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea would be that, like, you would say, how would a white middle-class suburban female at 35 in this district answer this question? I mean, it's to be seen, but I'm just curious if you saw any of that on the ground.
A little bit of that. It's a little bit of that. And I think that's probably where the future lies.
Yeah, then there's a lot of responsibility on these companies making the models. So since you're based in Florida and you've worked in a lot of Florida races, I'd like to talk a little bit about Florida. I think it's a very interesting state, right? It's one of these key swing states, or at least it was thought as a swing state, but also it's very diverse in terms of the population, race, gender, class, and particularly age. So I'm curious first on the swing state side. I mean, we saw Florida break quite heavily for Republicans this cycle. What do you think explains that shift to a sort of red state?
Yeah, it's basically similar to Mississippi or Ohio now. If you go back to 2018, DeSantis only beat Gilliam by a half a point, and Scott only won by less than a point. But there's been a radical change since, I think, COVID. I don't know if there's a million more Republicans now than Democrats. So that's one issue for the Democrats. The second issue is the Hispanic voters who, a lot of register as independent, who have gone Republican in some of the bigger counties like Osceola and Dade. I think Dade is a county that Hillary won, and then Trump won it overwhelmingly last election. So Florida's just shifted. States do shift. And look at Virginia, for instance, or Colorado. Colorado used to be a swing state. The state of Washington used to be a swing state. Oregon used to be a swing state. So states shift. And Florida shifted. The Republican Party is just really good here. The Democratic Party, not as much. And they've registered 1 million more people.
Yeah, but it's and I guess that's kind of the idea of a swing state, right? But at the same time, in 2000, you had, of course, this famous recount, and then a sort of shift to Hillary, and then now it seems to be going more Republican. I guess the question I'm trying to get to is, when you have a swing state, what makes it actually sort of solidify? Because I can't see in the immediate future Florida going Democratic. So do you think it's just in its sort of population to swing, or is in the party organization to swing it, or do you think it's now solidified?
I think it's solidified. The Republicans have had control since, 98? So they've had control for 30 years, and they've gained and gained and gained. The Democrats haven't won a governorship since 94. DeSantis won by almost 20 points, and Trump won by 13 points last time. So that's a lot. But there's other things that could happen. The Hispanic vote could move. You could see some of these new voters switch. You got a lot of older voters. You got to see what'll happen. So it could move.
Right. But let's play with the idea that it becomes this sort of Republican bastion, which I think with the discourse, it seems to be that, right? You have Texas and Florida as the Republican sort of, in a sense, like experimenters of hardcore Republican policy. And then you have New York and California sort of experimenting more with very progressive agenda, which is incentivizing people to move to Florida and to move to Texas if they want to live in that policy regime. And so what I'm thinking about is, if Florida does start moving more towards a really sort of radical, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but just extreme right-wing sort of policy, decentralization, no income tax, et cetera, then in a sense, that would be fertile grounds for this kind of extreme right versus moderate right battle to sort of play out. And I think we're starting to see that a bit with the governor's race, where you have basically this kind of MAGA versus moderate battle, because the left is not really in contest for the governorship, for example. So, I mean, from the ground, how is that your feeling as well, that it's going to be kind of...
Yeah, I'm on the same page. Yeah, exactly.
And how do you account for that in polling? Because if you just ask people, how Republican are you, then what does Republican actually mean when there's two kind of interpretations of it?
Well, it's a scale. It's how conservative someone is, right? They consider themselves moderate, very conservative, extremely conservative, slightly liberal, whatever. So you put them on a scale. So that's not hard to figure out. But I think in Florida, it's the numbers. The opposite has happened in Florida. It's happened in Georgia and North Carolina, and even South Carolina. You've had all these people that have moved here, and it's not the same people that moved here when I moved here 35 years ago. It's just a more conservative group of people. And like I said, the Hispanic vote has turned on the Democrats here for now.
Right. And I think I don't know who's actually migrating to Florida, but there is kind of this idea that it's a lot of older people who are retired, the so-called snowbirds, right? They move from the north down to the beaches. And one thing that's interesting about Florida is exactly that it has an older population. I think Maine is the only other state that has a higher per capita older population. And so I'm curious how that factors in both to polling methods, but also to how you're doing outreach, because there could be a scenario where older people are just plugged into a completely different tech ecosystem than younger people or, Hispanics or whatever it is. So how do you see that maybe fracturing by age in the technological landscape?
Of course, direct mail or phone calls, work better with an older crowd of people. You have an area here that's the Villages. I think it's about 55 and older. It's one of the fastest growing areas in the country. The whole city is 55 and older. So you target core Republican voters much differently. It's much easier to target, actually. You still can target them in the old ways.
Right. But there is some issues with direct mail in terms of costs, right? Like, isn't it getting much more expensive to send direct mail?
Yeah. The price of postage has gone up. And they talked about getting rid of the post office and turning it into the Commerce Secretary. So we'll see what happens there. If it's more of a per-profit center. I mean, political mail is its biggest, one of its biggest earners. So we'll see what happens there.
Really? But then I'm also thinking about, the Villages. I checked ahead of this interview. I think it has something like 600,000 or 800,000 people. But is this really the group that you want to target? Like, these are quite socialized voters. They're going to turn out. They're statistically likely to vote Republican. Are they worth contacting?
Yeah, they used to go to Republicans, let's say 60-40. Now Trump is winning rural America 80-20, for instance. So his numbers are just enormous in rural America, in some of these rural counties. And the Village is not really a rural county, but I'm just giving an example. And what it does is it destroys the gains they make in the big cities, Broward County, Orange County. And Trump won by 13 points. That's a huge victory. For now, Florida's off the table. We'll see what happens. Everything swings. It has a pendulum. I don't think it's forever, but.
No. And I guess my last question for you has to do again with this type of, Trump support. Do you see that in a state like Florida continuing? Because there's a lot of factors going on, right? There could be high inflation. There's the fact that this aging population is going to die quite soon, right? Or at least in 20 years where we might see turnover. And I wonder, how do you think that there will be some sort of MAGA continuation, or what would it take we talked a little bit about the partisan divide earlier, to sort of reverse that trend, or is it too far gone?
I think for now it's too far gone. I think the Democrats have to gain more at a local level and state elections. And they have to build up organically. The party's just been very bad here for 25 years. So that's part of the problem. There used to be more Democrats than Republicans, and they let them outgain them by 1 million votes. So that's really part of the problem, too, is the party. But I think the pendulum will swing. The demographics in Florida are much different than other states. So with Hispanic voters and young voters and all that.
But hasn't there been, and this is also something that's been quite in focus with, I think it was DeSantis and his performance in Miami-Dade County, where the Hispanic vote actually seems to be going more towards the right than the left.
Oh, yeah. For now. Yeah, absolutely. But we got to see what happens with immigration and all that,
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. But Doug, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. It's been a great time.
I've just been speaking with Doug Kaplan, president of Kaplan Strategies. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Neil Brown from the Poynter Institute about changing models of fact-checking, declining news trust, and the role of AI in journalism. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elmo. See you next time.